Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? At the back as well? The sound is okay online too? Okay. In case just let me know in case any changes. Perfect. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here together. My name is Vittorio Montemaggi, and I'm the Academic Director of Notre Dame London. And on behalf of Notre Dame London, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. And it's a privilege for us to be hosting this celebration of the Journal of Global History on the occasion of its 20th anniversary. So warmest congratulations to the journal and to everyone involved in it. I will shortly hand over to Elisabeth Leake for a fuller introduction of our event and of our distinguished speaker. Before that, allow me to say just a couple of words about our work here at Notre Dame London. Here in London, our work is part of the University of Notre Dame's broader commitment to global and interdisciplinary scholarship at a time in which international collaboration is more important than ever. Notre Dame is committed in multiple ways to building bridges across academic disciplines, communities, and cultures. More generally, as part of Notre Dame's global network, Notre Dame London serves the university in its international work, and one of the most important ways in which we do this is by helping convene academic gatherings of the highest quality, such as the present one. This has always been a central part of our work here, and even more so now as we have a new academic strategy that will allow us to support these kind of events and collaborations with even greater focus and energy. One of the ways in which we will do this is by offering support for innovative initiatives related to gatherings convened here, such as the present one. So we're profoundly grateful for our present event and look forward to seeing how the conversations it inspires will continue to develop. Please join me in welcoming Elisabeth Leake to introduce our event and our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Philippe and to the University of Notre Dame for hosting us here. It's really been a delight and a pleasure to be able to have an opportunity for us to celebrate 20 years of the Journal of Global History. So for those of you who don't know, there's no reason you should. So the Journal of Global History was founded in 2006. I was saying just actually not too far from here at the LSE. And it initially began out as a journal that was really focused on questions and debates around the notion of globalization and economic histories in a more global perspective. If you look at our pages now, you will see that kind of the materials and the pieces that we're publishing have really diversified, and I think really show that global history has become a really exciting and thought-provoking field. So I was so delighted when we were thinking about how could we sort of celebrate 20 years of the journal? How could we use this as a moment to think about what is the field of global history? How has it changed over, the last 20 years, if not more? I was really delighted that one of our board members for the journal, Stephanie Gänger, very kindly agreed to give a lecture, which will also, I should say, be appearing in print at some point, hopefully this year, in the journal. So Stephanie Gänger, for those of you who don't know, is professor of modern history at the University of Heidelberg. And she's co-director with Jürgen Osterhammel of the Balzan Research Group, Rethinking Global History. I should also add, I think especially for this audience in particular, Stephanie and Jürgen recently co-edited an open access volume, so free for everybody, on Rethinking Global History. Absolutely brilliant volume, and really, I think, super, super useful for thinking about and really showing how the field has changed in recent times. Since 2023, she's been the principal investigator of an ERC consolidator grant, Fever, offering a global history of fever, which I cannot wait to hear more about at some point. And she has held positions, it feels like, just about everywhere. She undertook her PhD here in the UK at the University of Cambridge, and has also studied in Augsburg and Seville, and has held positions at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. She's been at the University of Pennsylvania, and Sciences Po Paris, amongst other places. In 2019, she was awarded the Heinz Meyer-Leibniz Prize, which is Germany's most important award for early career academics. So again, giving you a sense of just her many, many, many incredible achievements. So Stephanie has published widely on histories of science, collecting, and medicine from the late 1700s up through the early 1900s. She's also done a lot of really important work too in terms of thinking about Latin America in global perspective and really forcing the integration of that region into global histories. Today, I think you can see the title of her paper, Come a Long Way, The Global Historian's Craft 20 Years On. I think we'll be hearing a little bit about Stephanie's work, but she's also going to be taking us through some reflections on the state of the field, where she sees it having come from and hopefully where it's going. And I think she says there should be some optimism. So we're really looking forward to that. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, also Guido, for the invitation, for the kind introduction, and also my thanks to our hosts here at Notre Dame. It's a great pleasure to be here. When Elisabeth and Guido asked me to give this lecture on the state of the art of our craft on the occasion of this 20th anniversary, to kind of revisit the field's past, say something about where it's headed, I felt really honored, but also really daunted, because and this is no false humility, I really was. How to do this without being partisan or trivial, neither triumphalist nor naive, neither catastrophist nor teleological, seemed really difficult to me, to say the least. What I've come up with is this. I'm a global historian a lot of the time, but I'm also a historian of science and knowledge, as you've just heard. And in what follows, I look at the first of these fields through the lens of the second, so through the history of science, especially in its historical epistemology variant, because that will allow me to study our field, our craft, in its historicity, but also from a certain distance, allows me to take a step back, if you like. And by historicity, I mean not that I'm going to give you a historical description, an account of some kind of linear development, but a historicization and a critical analysis of our field's standards and premises, our epistemic objects, values, troubles, our own ideas about its purpose and trajectory, and about its truth. I'll therefore not disdain you long with such a linear narrative, still I'll start with it, but very briefly. You'll know most of these, how global history took an institutional form. A lot of people sort of situated very much in the early 1990s when something got started, and a lot of people also take Bruce Masnich's collection of essays, which came out in 1993 as a starting point. Then, of course, you have, 96, the founding of the Journal of World History. You have the Great Divergence with Ken Pomeranz, Chris Bailey's Birth of the Modern World. And then in 2006, so about 13 years after it all started, the creation of the Journal of World History, a global history. It is worth reminding ourselves of that chronology for various reasons, because when the Journal of Global History was founded in 2006, global history was not entirely new anymore, but it was still in some measure unsettled. As Patrick O'Brien put it in the essay that famously served as a prolegomena for the journal in 2006, its practitioners at that time still felt they were working at an intellectual frontier. That's his phrasing, actually. There were still controversies at the time over how to call such history. And this is a quote from the AHA forum that came out that same year, actually. Would you call it global or world or transnational history? There were concerns over its durability, its seriousness, another quote. There were grievances over the scarcity and dearth of empirical research, like people saying, yeah, we keep talking about how to do, but there's not enough, and so on. And that frontier discourse would persist, and it would in many ways become part of a gesture, a dispositive of newness and novelty. Many would refer to the field into the early 2010s as a young field. You can read people talking about it as a field in its adolescence, right? So it is essentially a gesture that would for some time, and perhaps longer than strictly appropriate, remain wrapped around the field, the young field. That wore away a few years ago, and it morphed into a brief moment of overreach, perhaps, the hegemony of national historiography's over momentum of the 2010s. And that was followed by a different temporal dispositive, that of crisis. And I will return to this shortly. For me, just let me say for now that over the next half hour, I want to interrogate this idea of crisis. And I want to conclude not on a note of triumphalism, but with a more measured and more upbeat reading of the state of the field. Not just because the occasion calls for it, but also because there is evidence to support it. Before I do. So today, 20 years on, global history is an established, and in many ways, it's a solid and settled field of history with all the features that a historian of science would expect of an academic discipline or subdiscipline worthy of the name. You have a recognized community of scholars who are committed to a shared subject matter and a body of specialist knowledge, a community of scholars that shares methods or perhaps methodological challenges, whatever you prefer, standards of acceptable evidence. It's a field that has its own jargon, its own conceptual repertoire, again, sort of a key feature of any field, connectivity, globality, flow, circulation are the perennial favorites. It's interesting if you look at that. You could give a talk just on these terms. I won't. No? Just to say that they're concepts, they're also metaphors in many ways, and they have coalesced into epistemic objects as well. So, deceptively self-evident domains of inquiry. Like most scientific communities, the field also, if reluctantly, shares a lingua franca, one that allows speakers of different native languages like myself to communicate with one another. Again, more on this later. Since the early 2000s, global history has also developed its own institutional forums. We have associations and university departments and not least journals across many countries. Again, another indispensable feature of an academic field. And like any discipline since the 19th century, really, global history now boasts a venerable genealogy, or critics might say an invented tradition that lends it both cohesion and legitimacy. We have a lineage of ecumenical, relational, non-parochial historiography with godfathers that stretch back to Herodotus and Ibn Khaldun and Voltaire and whoever else you want to invoke. And interestingly, this is precisely what Patrick O'Brien was asked to provide in the journal's 2006 Prolegomenon. They asked him to give some historiographical elaboration upon an ostensibly but far from modern field of history. That's what you do when you want to root a field, give it roots so people can't take it away again. You give it a long history. Over the past 2 decades, global history has also seen its share of feuds and rivalries and dissent. And that's another crucial accomplishment that any self-respecting scientific or humanistic discipline would want to lay claim to, right? If you, as a historian of science, you want to know whether it's a field, you check out whether they have rivalries and struggle and quarrel. And if they do, you know that it's a thing, it's a community. Not least, no, it's a good thing. It means it's alive. Not least, there are both sophisticated internal taxonomies and tendencies of dissipation, fragmentation, withdrawal. Several approaches with family resemblances that are immediately recognizable to outsiders, trans-imperial history, entangled history, world-connected history, whatever, they will assert their distinctiveness, declare their autonomy, it's quite different because, And all of these are also sure signs that global history has become visible as a bounded entity, something that one might define oneself against, something you can cast as a straw man, because it's a thing, right? It's something you can distance yourself from. But for us, it's a sign that it's an entity. So to the historian of science, the defining features of a scientific community, a discipline, a subfield of history, they're all there. You did it, right? Now, like I said earlier, in the early 2010s, the rhetoric of the new field gave way to a short period of triumphalism, some would say overreach. The hegemony of national historiography is over momentum, though David Armitage's original formulation was more aspirational than triumphalist, right? Like Chris Bailey's 2004, all historians are world historians now line. But what followed that was a rhetoric of the field in crisis or under attack. And it's this anxiety that I'd like to start with. To do so, I'll need to take a step back first, but I'll get to it eventually. Whether or not we situate the new global history within a longer tradition, few would dispute that the field assumed its current contours, sense of purpose, and momentum in the Anglophone post-Cold War world of the 1990s and early 2000s, a period that witnessed the ascendancy of both the reality and not least in the social sciences, the idea and the concept of globalization. The first generation of global historians tied the field to that leitmotif, as O'Brien put it in the 2006 essay, and with it, they tied it to politics, to values, right? To the cosmopolitan enterprise, the educational and historiographical needs of a globalizing world. And if you look at the stuff that's coming out today, especially in its popular variant, this educational impetus is still there. You know, Patrick Boucheron's 2017 Histoire mondiale à la France, for instance, but also all these other histories of nations. They are political books, essentially. They convey a pluralistic, diverse narrative of French history, and they're supposed to educate people to be pluralistic, cosmopolitan, etc. More than we care to admit, much of the field's understanding of history also remains infused with that presentism, but there it's much more complex, you know, our ability to account for a globalized world. And with it, it has a sense of direction, a telos. Global historians, of course, like to regard themselves as the vanguard of anti-teleology and anti-Eurocentrism and anti-nationalism. We overcame all of that. But even if not all global historians study global integration anymore, there is a sense of direction that's implicit in much of the field's research interests. It's at its academic core in a way still, when it's important to be aware of that, you know, in the spread of ideas, the crafting of connection, the formation of networks. That's not uncommon, right? A sense of direction is something you find in a lot of history writing, histories of democracy, for instance, for a very long time, but essentially sagas of advances and reverses in the realization of an ideal. Histories of, or environmental histories have their own negative teleology of environmental destruction. So a lot of fields have a sense of direction in that sense. And in part, its politics was the field's attraction. Unlike cultural histories, which were always better at tearing down than rebuilding, as Lynn Hunt phrased it, or to put it more respectfully, sophisticated deconstruction and critique of paradigms, global history had a succinct purpose. It had a message. It had a much better answer in response to the what is it actually good for question. As any historian of historiography will tell you, the relation between present-day concerns and the study of the past has long been controversial, and we've discussed it for a long time. And wherever you stand on it, there is no denying the epistemological perils of presentism and teleology, not necessarily to our research integrity, I'll come back to this, but to our understanding of historical complexity and contingency, to our sense of proportion, as critics were right to emphasize, I think, and not least, and that's perhaps the worst of it, to our ability to surprise, right? You know that knowledge will circulate, you know that traveler will arrive, you know that plant will travel, and so on. What has troubled global historians the most, however, is another consequence of presentism. Like other areas of the humanities that tied their fate to a cause and to values, think of post-colonial studies or queer history or environmental history, there was and is considerable anxiety that the field might come under pressure as those values have changed, especially in the countries that championed them. Plausibly, there was great concern starting about 10 years ago in 2016, when nationalism and disintegration became palpable with Brexit and then Donald J. Trump's first term in the United States, that global history would also come under attack, that it might have had its moment, as Jeremy Edelman put it in this 2016 Aeon piece that we all know. Whether that has in fact occurred or will yet occur is much harder to determine than we might think. Has it? Global history undoubtedly is, and it will further be severely affected by a world, a culture of anti-intellectualism and warfare, economic deglobalization, epistemic rot, fiscal austerity, and energy crisis, not least in the very direct form of budget cuts at universities in countries that pioneered global history, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. What is much less clear, however, is whether global history has been affected disproportionately, more so than other historical fields, or indeed other areas of the humanities and sciences. We all know about the importance of perspective and vantage point, and I suggest we adopt a perspective centered on the Journal of Global History for the day, not because the occasion calls for it again, but because as the field's leading journal, it offers a reasonably reliable indicator of publishing trends and, by extension, the state of the field more broadly. And from this perspective, at least, there is actually very little evidence to suggest decline, let alone crisis, rather the opposite. The number of submissions, if you look at that, has continued to rise. There was actually no rupture after 2016. The opposite happened. According to editorial statistics that were very kindly shared with me, article submissions increased by about 115% between 2015-16 and 2024-25. As befits our field, submissions coming from all over the world, from Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Turkey, Jordan, Germany, etc. Though it has to be said that the highest acceptance rates are still for UK authors, with authors from Indonesia, China, Turkey, Jordan, and tragically Germany trailing very far behind. Yeah, we gotta work on this. Still, our authorship, though it's heavily weighted towards the Anglosphere, is much broader than that of comparable journals, with contributors based in, Temuco, Chile, Belgian Ghent, in Cairo, in Oslo, and Seville, really around the world. And what is also important that if you look at it comparatively, the journal has for years been among the highest ranking journals in the field of history. And Elisabeth already talked about that. But in 2020, we ranked first among all history journals by impact factor. And we've consistently been in the top 6 since that year, just about top 3% in history journals worldwide by CIMAGO. And we currently rank 5th for history journals worldwide by Google Scholar. And you have to actually control for field size. So you can take out the economics and business journals, because they're read by economists, so they don't really count. So actually, past and present is number 1, and we're actually 2nd by that count. So judging by those metrics, we're well able to compete with, and we actually outcompete many general interest English language history journals like Past and Present, like Comparative Studies and Society and History, American Historical Review. At present, we even have a higher 5-year impact factor than American Historical Review. And what is also really important is that we're competing with the general interest journals, not with the specialist journals. If you look at comparable subfield journals like Environmental History, for instance, which is the world's leading journal in that field, or ISIS, which is the most prestigious journal in the history of science, medicine, and technology, we're way, way ahead of that. Also, the popular appeal of the field seems unbroken. If you take best-selling books like Boucheron's or Sven Beckert's recent Global History of Capitalism, which is top of feuilletons, top of Amazon sales lists, and by the way, will be launched around the corner at LSE this evening. There is no evidence for any sort of decline on the other hand. It's quite the opposite, actually. What is more is that global history is by now, it's both a field, but it's also a sensibility. It's a perspective, it's a form of attention to relations, to acts of recourse that many historians across the world are expected to acquire in their training. Again, not all, but many. It has inscribed itself within, in a way it has infiltrated, if you like, or enlightened, whatever you prefer, other modes of historical research, to the point where a majority of the articles that are published in the Journal of Global History could just as well be published in American Historical Review or Journal of Social History or Past and Present, and vice versa, actually. And I dare you, you can read sort of the titles of the journal, but I dare you to allocate them, and you'll have a hard time placing them in journals, actually. It's almost interchangeable. That infiltration or enlightenment cuts both ways. Writing this piece has given me a welcome excuse to spend an agreeable few days perusing articles across the 60 issues of the Journal of Global History that have come out since March 2006. And many of the charges that were initially and are sometimes still, laid at the field's door, like elitism, it's just unusually cosmopolitan, the eschewal of stasis, of violence, you don't talk about culture, you're connectivist, and so on. Very little of this holds any longer, and that's partly because global historians have absorbed the virtues of other historical subfields, other approaches. The last few issues of the Journal of Global History included pieces on stuff like pastoralists' markets in Central Asia, right? So essentially on non-elite actors, unconvertible currencies like the ruble, which is a good example of sort of something that does not travel, post-war ideas about madness and the universality of the psyche, overpopulation, family planning, war crimes in the Korean War, and so on. Even where the piece's emphasis rested on connections themselves, the research was very much infused with histories of technology and the everyday and the workplace. And I'll only cite one of my favorites, a piece on the distant listeners of Ugandan radio broadcasting in the 1970s, at a time when people were hunting for radio signals on sensitive shortwave receiving sets, and when that was a global pastime, right? So you get all these geeky Germans who write letters to the Ugandan radio stations and kind of communicate with them. At any rate, what I'm trying to say with all of this, with all of my sort of impact factors and publication statistics and anecdotes, is that it's going really well for the field in many ways. And it's curious that in spite of all that wealth and success, the discourse of global history being in some kind of crisis, or worse, dead, and I'm quoting Edelman again, should have taken on a strange life or momentum of its own. Crisis has always encompassed both the objective, it's a palpable event, it's a process, and the subjective judgment and perception of it. Crisis also has, since the 1780s, as Reinhard Koselleck would tell you, become an increasingly ubiquitous and vague gesture, one that is inherent in modernity and its understanding of temporality, progress, decline, the pliability of the future. Like risk or endangerment, or indeed newness or momentum, it's a means to dramatize, rally, a call for constant renewal. Its use has several consequences, not least that of rendering the object in supposed crisis a cause. Again, we're not alone in this. The humanities themselves, which are, supposedly in a perpetual decline and crisis, have very much become a cause recently. And here I'm quoting Aaron Hanlon, a thing to be saved, to be defended, like the whales or the manatees. For global history, however, that is both unwarranted and it's dangerous because it's potentially circular. If you keep telling people we're in a crisis, they will think that we are, right? What is more, it misses not only that ours is in many ways a thriving field, but also that its coming-of-age story is classic. It's really conventional, not exceptional, actually, for a historical or any field, really. Let me return to presentism for a moment, and you'll see in a minute where this is going. I'm going to come back to the conventional. In many ways, even our presentism has been fruitful and productive. Somewhat counterintuitively, it has been productive of truth. Now, as any historical epistemologist or historian of historiography will be glad to inform you, the historian's truth has always been a humble one. There is no metaphysical, historical truth independent of place or writer, and all our representations of the past are provisional and they are epistemologically imperfect. Historians attain only phenomena, things as they're perceived by us, shadows on the wall. As Achim Landwehr put it, we always operate within the paradox that the only thing we can say about past events with certainty is that they did not unfold exactly as we represent them. We will never know how it really was. History, in the necessary absence of the past, is the effect of a description that is never complete. Presentism would seem to exacerbate that necessary imperfection, but as scholars have argued for some time, the binary between normativity, ideology, civic and political engagement on the one, and detached analysis, objectivity, professionalism, scrupulous research on the other is a false dichotomy in many ways. It's a false dichotomy not only because, despite the necessary humility, the historian's principal obligation still is to pursue the truth, as in to write with integrity, as Marc Bloch would have put it. The politics versus truth formulation is also a false dichotomy because at its best, the dialogue, and even more so the friction between the present and the past, is a productive one that sets off debates, internal or loud, between the historian and her sources, as Sarah Mesa put it, raises new questions, improves, thickens our ever incomplete descriptions. The present can draw our attention to some of the many possibilities that lie dormant within the historical, pieces of which we only a few years ago did not suspect they might one day be part of our history. History is a selection of facts, to use Edward Carr's classic formulation, out of all the myriad facts that must once have been known to somebody. And our questions, possibilities, and circumstance, in short, our present, will add to these. Now, the inception of the new global history in the 1990s and early 2000s was neither the first nor likely the last time for our craft, for history, to gravitate to and renew itself through subjects reflecting current concerns. Think of race, think of the nation state in the 19th century, think of the environment, think of women and gender. Very often, these approaches begin with a certain triumphalism and actually overconfidence. As Chris Bailey put it in the 2006 AHA conversation, he remembered the experience of the 50s and the 60s and 70s and the 80s when first area studies and then family history and then local history and then others succeeded each other as the new Holy Grail. In time, these fields' Holy Grail momentum would pass, and the present-day concerns that had given rise to them, like the Cold War that supported area studies, for instance, would be removed or change or lose its immediate relevance. And yet most of these once holy grails would persist, both as institutionalized fields with their own institutes and conferences and journals, and as sensibilities, perspectives, forms of attention that would inform and deepen the wider field of history. Many years ago, in 1979, in the framework of a very different controversy over history, and long before the new global history was even discussed, the German intellectual and historian Golo Mann wrote about what was to him the most important progress that had been achieved over the last years in the field of history. The proliferation of questions one could ask, the increase in the number of possible subjects a historian could attend to. All of a sudden, he wrote, by the late 1970s, there were peasants, there was a working class, there were women even. I mean, who would have thought, you know? The world of the past seemed to have grown richer, more interesting, so much more complex. And that is exactly what the ecumenical, relational, non-parochial historiography of the last few decades, which I call global history, but it doesn't signify, can lay claim to too. A claim that is both modest and colossal, that of having added and of continuing to add to the questions, the subjects, the variety of the angles of vision that add up to and that constitute history, our humble truth. Global history is no smooth sailing. It has never been, probably never will be. For one thing, the practice of global history is difficult, and I don't think we talk about that enough. We cannot treat our parameters as though they were a given. The very choice of locality, suitable unit of analysis, our periodization, any category of analysis requires reflection because none of them are sanctioned by tacit, that is, national conventions. Many of the historians' basic cognitive instruments, the use of a meta-language, comparison, explanation, rely on abstraction, on the reduction of complexity, and they're therefore much more difficult for the global historians because they handle an unusual plurality of variables and social and cultural configurations, very often an overabundance of material, profusion of disparate evidence, many different regularities, right? And I'm showing this because some of the categories that I just mentioned are discussed in the book. It's difficult also because having a lingua franca does not, as has sometimes been suggested, necessarily correspond to flatness or an inability to read sources in foreign languages. Rather, good global historical practice requires language proficiency. Between the beginning of 2015 and the second edition of 2020, authors in the Journal of Global History quoted sources in literature in French, Norwegian, Latin, Portuguese, German, Russian, German, Arabic, Mandarin, Indonesian, Tamil, Welsh, Japanese, Turkish, Ukrainian, Bengali, Swahili, to name but a few. And that's not easy, right? Because there is often this thing that just because you have a lingua franca, you don't read, but really read in a number of other languages. Global history is no smooth sailing also because it has set itself high, and given the world that we live in, the very hierarchical, uneven global academic system in which we operate, often impossibly high standards. Yes, the world that we live in is unfair, and when it comes to the possibilities of a fairer global history, it's almost impossible. Look at the access to published research, archives, or funding. It's completely unequal, as is our degree of freedom from political pressure, as is, the diversity of our authors. It's always insufficient. Obviously, our lingua franca is reflective of a linguistic hierarchy, yes. And obviously, the regional distribution of our epistemic objects is still not fair in the way that authors have have critiqued, and this is actually the regional distribution, it's getting closer to one another, but you still see a certain inequality. So in many ways, we are actually doing better than others, but we're fighting an uphill battle, and we're severe upon ourselves because our standards are higher, right? And some of those we're bound to fail against because of the world that we live in. Doesn't mean we should stop trying. It's just saying that the conditions are not good at the moment. Another reason why global history is no smooth sailing, to continue with that metaphor, is because some of the field's traits go against the grain of the epistemic virtues, the norms and the imperatives instilled, praised, rehearsed among historians as the proper way to know. Global history is no longer closely associated with structuralism and meta-narratives in the macro scale, as it was in the earliest iterations. But by definition, even in its micro variant, it will relate the particular to the general, right? That's the whole idea, to the wider, the global process. It will seek to abstract and it will seek to aggregate to macro level in some way or another. And that can be alienating. Postmodernism and the cultural turn have instilled in historians an aversion to grand narratives, all-embracing formulas, even to generalization more broadly sometimes. What is more, historians tend to associate the histories of the lower level, the confined scene, the micro, the material object, the local, with superior epistemic qualities, with truthfulness, with rigor, with reality, with the promise of stability, also epistemological safety, immediacy. That's very, very deeply ingrained in us. Chris Bailey clairvoyantly anticipated that in 2006. He said, colleagues would dismiss global history. They would insist that the only way to do real history was at the level of the local, the family, the experience. Decades ago already, Jacques Revel criticized the delusion. He said, historians associate the microscale with the concrete, the particular, the empirical, the tangible, but that is misguided. The level of the individual is more granular, but it's not more empirical than the level of societal interaction. That persists, however, and I hear it implicit in much of the skepticism and the reticence about global history. It's often the reason why people don't do it, or it's also part of the reason, I think, for the appeal of the global microhistories, because there's this promise that you can get it back in. Global history goes against the epistemological grain in other ways too. The synthesis variant of global history, but also other modes like even just the pursuit of an object of study across time, space, and specialism, even global microhistorians' practice of following an object will invariably, almost invariably, take us to places or subject areas of which we do not have a deep, serious, or expert understanding. That was one of the field's core ideas, right? It was not just about overcoming geographical confines. It was about overcoming the thematic fragmentation of the historiography, the segmentation of scholarly expertise into discrete specialisms. That, however, is the textbook definition of dilettantism. It's an epistemic sin that some historians have admitted they fear to commit when straying beyond their region of study. There's an anxiety, and we don't talk about that enough, I think, as soon as you move beyond what you consider your area of expertise. And again, the historical epistemologist can explain that anxiety, where that comes from. Ever since modern academic disciplines first emerged in the late 19th century, when a divided map of knowledge won out over a paradigm of common erudition, which was, the ideal earlier on, the deprecation of dilettantism became a norm. It was no longer thought possible that a scholar could work responsibly in two widely separated locations. The victory of disciplinary specialists entailed a new ideal of how research should be carried on in one single area of knowledge. Global history is no smooth sailing because it requires us to go against the grain of many epistemic virtues, including this one, that have been instilled in us. What we are taught is our forte, in-depth knowledge of the one context in which a particular historical phenomenon is situated. And we go against that all the time. And that's why we struggle and why we're also critiqued in a way. And yet, though it may be immensely difficult, and though it may be bound to disappoint in some measure, always, and though it may be very much against the grain of what you've been taught to believe, there is no way back from the global turn, to quote David Mortadella and Richard Drayton, any more than we could go back to a history which paid no attention to women or the poor. There is no way back because, as Bloch put it, our obligation is to write history with integrity, with truth, with the utmost penetration. And for many periods and places, the truth cannot be apprehended through history that is narrow or parochial, that comes with blinders. For these, anything short of a relational, ecumenical, global, whatever world history is but a makeshift solution, as Jürgen Osterhammel put it already in 2009. Following an epistemic object across space and spatialism will take you to places or to subject areas of which we do not have expert understanding, but not to follow them. To hold our narrative at the border would be untruthful. It would be but a fraction that improperly pretends to be a whole. Our truth is that some persons, ideas, and forms of matter in the past did not stay put. Think of migrants and nomads, think of fashions and democracy, or fascism for that matter, of phosphates or microplastics. Our truth is that some phenomena occur, manifest, operate globally. Financial crises since 1873, at the very least, climate anomalies, and political processes such as nation-state formation or indeed warfare and aggression. After all, as David Bell put it, the most direct form of connection imaginable. Global history, understood as a form of geographical freedom and openness of the attention, has also added to the quality of historians' explanations. It has made them more truthful, more complete. David Bell, I think, quite rightly warned against overstating the weight of external influences over internal causes in our explanation. But to leave external influences out, that was never his claim, to be sure, it would lead to less complete, to wrong, to partial explanations, right? Of course, it's about proportion, but it's the only truth is in fullness. The best possible answer to the why question in the case of Bell's critique, that was the French Revolution, will encompass a variety of factors, from French involvement in the American War of Independence to the harsh winter of 1789 to the abolition of feudal privileges and so on. So some of these factors will be within France and others will be far, far away. So much of what historians see in the past, especially but by no means exclusively the modern past, is neither explicable nor understandable without taking into consideration the wider world. Think of the very nature, forests, their composition or loss, the countryside in which our historical subjects moved, from the 1500s at least, can only be accounted for, explained by virtue of these societies' relation, trade, wars with other distant ones. Ditto, the very fabric they wore on their bodies, the landscape of contagious disease in which they suffered and died. Ditto, from the 1800s, the price of the bread on their tables, their social insurance, which was following either the German capitalist or the Soviet socialist model. Also, it's only the readiness to see as wide as the world that allows us to gauge the accurate, the true geographical expanse and scope of any phenomenon, the relevance or irrelevance of it for societies around the world, as well as its boundaries. A global perspective also prevents us from drawing wrong conclusions. And that, I think, also cannot be emphasized too much. In pushing authors to attend to similarities, relations, influences from elsewhere, it prevents you from misjudging features that you might otherwise erroneously think of as idiosyncratic or singular or vernacular or homegrown. And I recommend one last piece here on the reception of Zen Buddhism among Nazi ideologues and how their version of it then transitioned into the post-New War and New Age movement. Like cultural histories before us, which shocked readers into understanding that the categories they took for granted, the body, pain, manliness, were not natural, global histories have taken all the naturalness out of the vernacular, the national, or the universal. Global history has also added range and fullness to the jigsaw that is history, because it insists that its practitioners move, even if with different emphases, between close-range observation and the bird's eye or the eagle's view and vantage point, pushes us to apprehend the past across a range of analytically distinct levels of analysis, each with its own heuristic potential, to place these tiers in dialogue through a deliberate orchestration of perspectives that refines and thickens our understanding of the past in a collective corrective practice, one that is less liable than others to what Gaurav Garg referred to as defanged empiricism, that is, descriptive particularist scholarship that is unable to alter, affect, or even discourse with our understanding of wider processes or prevailing conceptualizations. Even our enthrallment with the telos of global integration has added in many ways to our description, to the truth of our descriptions of the past. Global historians quite rightly have recently turned to processes of disintegration and fragmentation, of which there have been plenty, of course, from the fall of Latinity to decolonization. And yet there is no denying that global historians have exposed with global integration a fundamental historical process, one that undeniably affected how matters unfolded within history, a process that was at times so central, so commandeering, that without it the past cannot be rightly understood. Kept you long enough, I'll conclude briefly. The ecumenical, relational, non-parochial histories of the past few decades, of which the Journal of Global History has become the most prominent home, have altered the face of history. Our ever-incomplete descriptions and explanations of the past, now bound with themes and questions, with persons and processes that 20 years ago, let alone at the time of Bloch's or Mann's writing, no one would have imagined might one day be part of history. It was completely unthinkable, as David Cannadine once observed, literally unimaginable only a few decades ago. Some of this is owing to you, to us, who have helped produce a broadened and deepened history, one that has shocked the wider field out of its certainties and into new truths, one animated in part by the friction between past and present that, at its best, opens a portal to new interpretation of both. Standing on the shoulders of giants, area, post-colonial, subaltern studies, which first urged us to provincialize Europe, global historians have radically altered our sense of what is central and what is marginal in the past. They've expanded our angles of vision and our analytical agility and strength. They've enriched the fullness of our view and the completeness of our ever incomplete explanations. They've taught us to look not only for answers, but for questions everywhere, as Karavkar put it. 20 years on, the field of global history knows its value and purpose, its limitations and difficulties, its strengths and its truths. It knows that it has brought the world into history and that this is no small thing. Thank you for listening.
Sorry, essentially, Stephanie has very kindly agreed to take questions both from in the room, but also online, which Gita's keeping an eye on. But so we're keeping this as casual as possible. But if you ask a question, if you could be so kind as to say your name or type it into the chat, that would be super.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm a first-year PhD candidate in international history at LSE. And I wanted to ask you to speak more about this concept of presentism and the accusation that is often put upon global historians as something that I've experienced. And I guess more specifically, how we might suggestions on how we might talk about this or address it when it's kind of put into conversation with regards to our work. I think for me personally, I've always tried to talk about, the long, looking at history, I guess the longue durée, and how inherently everything that is in our world now was shaped by what happened before. Therefore, kind of saying that something is presentist is kind of, to me, contradictory, or isn't that the whole point of what we're doing? Isn't everything presentist then? So yeah, I guess any advice you have for early career historians.
Well, the whole critique of presentism, essentially, the basic idea is that our interests must not come out of the present, but out of the past, right? And scholarly communities are comfortable with presentism to a very different degree. It's partly the differences are national. So in the United States, I feel that people are more comfortable with it. In countries like Germany, I don't know about Britain, but less so. I would guess continental Europe also less so, and so on. So you find different takes and positions on that. But of course, it's in a way, especially the critique of it is not honest, because a lot of what we do and many of our interests, and that was the point that I was trying to make, come out of the present. And it's not just global history, it's so many other fields, right? And to deny that is wrong. And I think the fear mostly is about distortion, but it has become one of those gestures of accusation, like teleology, for instance. It's a horrible thing. You're accused of that in a conference. You may leave the room. You know, it's but it's not entirely fair, right? And my claim was to say, in a way, we all do that, and in a way, it's fair to do that, so long as you, you know, practice, sort of abide by good scholarly practice. There is no shame. There's nothing wrong with it.
Thank you for a great talk. So I'm Alexander Gould. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Warburg Institute. And so you mentioned the kind of the move away from what I think you termed sort of parochial history. And you know, a focus on, you know, the histories of particular nations and stuff from a more global perspective. So I work on the kind of sort of 17th century history in North America, like what's now Canada, and First Nations history there. And I'm just thinking about something that Mackenzie Cooley wrote in an interesting recent Renaissance Quarterly article called, she termed it the Patchwork Columbian Exchange. And the argument in that, or one of the big arguments she makes, was that a focus on sort of local circumstances and individuated actions can actually be very revelatory about sort of indigenous agency and contingency in the face of changes attempted to be sort of imposed by colonial authorities or colonial influences, if you like. So I'm just, and I definitely agree with that. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do you reconcile that sort of local and individuated focus with that benefit it brings with the kind of the sort of global ambitions of global history? I hope my question is clear.
Well, I mean, I think that's the whole idea of the field, is to bring that together, right? To not remain at the structural level, but over the past few years, that has been the trend, to precisely bring that. I have an interest in the term local. You know, it has become an interesting word that we use a lot. And if you've seen it, we use it almost as often as global, even in the journal. And it's become a gesture towards something that is, on the one hand, it's often used as a synonym for indigenous, native, whatever. But it also is a synonym for that which does not move, that which is somehow not touched by change and globalization and modernity. It's one of those gestures that we use when we say that something is not moving, something is not part of this wider process. And I think that that's a yearning, a very Western yearning for authenticity, for the unchanged, for that which does not participate in modernity. And as such, I would actually regard it quite critically. But the whole point is that this dichotomy of the global and the local is a product of the 1990s, when there was this idea that there was the one thing and there was the other thing, and that's nonsense. And I think we've moved beyond that for quite a while. There, you know, it's not a dichotomy, it's a spectrum. And essentially our work is about how the two relate to one another.
Well, maybe I should take the opportunity of the moment quiet to ask a question myself, if I may. It was wonderful talk, and very gratifying to see how you could use the history of the journal to trace the history of the field. And you can't cover everything in one lecture, but it was also very impressively comprehensive. It's difficult to think of. Nevertheless, I do want to ask you about one thing you didn't mention, and I preface this by saying that I'm thinking back so pleased you started with Patrick O'Brien. I'm thinking back to, because of course Patrick who introduced me to the idea of global history. And he started a global history seminar in Oxford in the 1980s when, this was practically a guerrilla action. And I was just thinking about the things that characterize the people whom that seminar brought together. And a lot of them were interested in the things that you rightly mentioned, in the prehistory of global history, all the intellectual traditions that fed into it, especially environmental history. That's very, very well represented. And that was another thing which was hated in Oxford at the time.
Okay.
And also the history of science. And Needham had been a tremendous, I don't know, sort of power in getting people to see the history of science as a global phenomenon. Obviously, the Eurocentric debate, that was what particularly interested Patrick at the time. But one of the things that was also present that you didn't mention at all was the history of religion. Because people were very interested, especially in Oxford, where there's also a big theological fraternity. A lot of people were very interested in the problem of how a religion bursts its cultural limits, because religions tend to be very culturally specific, and there are very few that have bucked that trend, Christianity being the outstanding exception, to say Islam, Buddhism to a great extent. But an awful lot of people are interested in the history of Christianity, and the history of missions, also brought a lot of people into the seminar. So would you be kind enough just to try and situate the kind of religious dimension in what you said?
Yes, with pleasure. I mean, that's something I know well, actually, from my own field, from Latin American history, because the ways in which historians of Latin America branched out into global history was very much through the history of the missions, especially the Jesuits, which were, some of the early global figures in a way that historians of Latin America discovered, and that allowed them to then participate in the conversation of global history. So I see that. Actually, I didn't see that much of sort of global histories of Christianity in the journal over the past few years. I don't know whether there might have been a decline, but it was definitely in the early phase, it's true, one of the topics that brought people together, especially the history of missions, which are sort of obviously global actors in an interesting way. Would you agree? It's less prominent now, I think.
Yeah, I guess all I can think of is I edited a piece on Christian missionary, I think, children's literature and world making, which was really brilliant. But yeah, no, I don't think religion has not been necessarily as.
And if it is now, it's Buddhism. I quoted that one piece and the Islamic.
Thank you.
Two of the
Ria, and then I think the gentleman in front of Ria.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My name is Ria Kapoor. I'm a historian of refugees and migration at Queen Mary. I have to say, your talk gave me a lot of existential angst. And I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very erudite today, so I'm going to try and keep this simple. But it occurs to me that a lot of what we do right now, and you were talking about global history as a sensibility, right? A lot of what we do now comes from the people who, and we were just talking about this, don't have easy access to archives. It comes from the subaltern school, the post-colonial school. It comes from early modernists. It comes from parts of the world where what we do forces us to be more creative, and creates new methodologies, and forces us away from the local, forces us away from the national, because that's not an easy go-to. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned that briefly in terms of, it's one of those things where you mention it and move away from it, or you talk about it all the time, because obviously that's the injustice in a way that was one of the prime movers of the field, and that still pervades all academic fields. But practitioners in our field tend to be much more aware of it for obvious reasons, right? And the reason that I didn't go to it is because I don't have anything intellectually interesting to say about it, It's something that I can lament and that I can be very unhappy about, but it's not something that I have a good idea on, how to solve it or how to overcome it. Unfortunately, I don't. I wish I had, nor is it something that I had anything interesting to add to. But I'm perfectly aware of it. And I really think that, that's one of the it's not a problem that is particular to our field, not at all. And like I said, I think it's actually worse in other fields in terms of representation and the attempts, the endeavor, the efforts that we make to overcome that. We're doing relatively well, right? But we live in an academic world that's governed by structures that are just not fair. And I think, I applaud the editorial board and Elisabeth and Guido with the workshop, for instance, that we just attended this afternoon, where they try to bring in authors from countries where, the training might be in a way that means that their work is not represented in the style that the journal wants and so on, and to help them bring it into the shape that is required. So I think that's wonderful. That's great. And you could always do more, I suppose. You have to. But at least we're in a field that tries, That's something.
You had your hand up earlier. Yeah. Sorry, I feel bad just like pointing at it. It's like, it's like, we don't know names. Apologize.
No worries. I'm Patrick Griffin. I'm here at Notre Dame. And I guess it's a follow-up on that very good question that we just heard. And it's not to depress everybody, but just to kind of, I'm wondering if crisis is the right word that we've been dealing with. And I wonder if there's a kind of a fundamental flaw in the field. And I think about the people that you've mentioned, Sven Becker, David Armitage, Bell, Edelman, Drayton, Bailey, Osterhamel, O'Brien. These are very senior scholars from elite institutions. And I'm wondering if there is a flaw that is necessarily built in. Number one, to do it and to deal with the criticism you're going to get of not being local enough, that means you got to go to various kinds of archives. That means you got to have resources to go to archives. That means that sometimes you have research assistants, as Bernard Balin, for example, did a generation or two ago, full-time over here in Europe, to be able to do these kinds of things. It also means that you're in a senior enough position that you don't necessarily have to worry about the criticism of dilettantism. If I'm a chair at full professor at Harvard, this is something that I'm not necessarily concerned about, as opposed to being a graduate student who has to cut his or her teeth in this field. So I wonder, I don't know if there's kind of an answer to this, but it strikes me, and it has always struck me, that this always sounds great, but there are a few people who are kind of situated well enough in order to really do it effectively.
Interesting what you say about dilettantism being something that you can dare to embrace or go for the higher up you're in the hierarchy. It's an interesting thought. I might actually bring it into the written version. In general, I would say, like I said, access to resources are unequal. And yes, in our field, you may need more resources, so it may be even more unequal. That's a fair point, I think. But particularly the idea of it was for a very long time, it was a very male field. That's true. It's becoming less so, I think. But even that, the grand gesture of saying, I go across 3 continents was something that, for a time was reserved for a certain kind of person, and that you have to dare to engage in even today. So you're right, of course.
Hi, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I have perhaps a steady question is how global is global history in the sense that, sometimes we can think of a global phenomena as the emergence of capitalism, quite very global, and then sometimes thrusted onto certain countries with colonialism. And there are also articles like you demonstrated, which is fascinating, like the Zen Buddhism and the Nazism connection. But then that really feels like two kind of far-flung places and then just connected, so perhaps that was not entirely like the globe, but two localities, with a certain connection. So I was wondering how do we mean when we say global? Thank you.
So generally speaking, we don't mean all of the world. And I think that's actually one of the problems with the label, that it can be misleading because people feel that pressure. It has to be the whole world. And of course it isn't, it can't be. And when you're pre-1500, it sort of technically cannot be that. So that would have been an argument, I think, for a different kind of name, because it tends to mislead people. And it has this grandeur that you can never fulfill, and that very few projects actually fulfill. Yes, but in general, I would say, I mean, you can say more about the sort of the kind of scope and range that most articles in the journal in the field have, and it goes beyond the continent, basically. That's the rule of thumb, I would say, but it doesn't have to cover everything, and in fact, it can. And you just follow your object, you follow your theme wherever it takes you, and if it takes you to 3 continents or to 4, you have to do that, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, exactly. Some things don't go that far, they don't travel that far, and you obey that, you're bound by that in a way.
Yeah, I'm gonna because I can. I'm gonna just pop in really quickly. I think on that point, and actually Patrick's point and Ria's points as well, because I think one of the things I really enjoyed studying about your talk is kind of thinking about the methods and actually training for historians too, right? And the fact that actually I think so many people, with the exception of, let's say, PhD programs at places like, at least in North America at Harvard or Yale, there are not a lot of programs where you get explicit training in global history. So it is this question too, which I really like about this tension between the way so many historians are trained in terms of depth and nuance and kind of real deep local, I'm gonna use the term local knowledge, but then how do you translate to the kind of global? And I think this relates that I think methodologically to your question about how do we, you know, it's like, how do you reconcile kind of interest in these connections or these broader issues and schema while also still sort of staying true to the ways in which we're trained and the archives to which you can use. So I think that's really one important point. But I think another conversation that, you know, that I'd say at the journal we've certainly been having, and I have with global historians more broadly, is this question too of the ways in which different areas of global history don't necessarily speak to each other. And I mean this particularly in terms of thinking about the English language tradition of global history versus, let's say, the German language. I would say the English and German language global history scholarship is more in dialogue than, let's say, the French history, like French global history, which I am currently wrestling with. But also, for example, there is a developing and fairly strongly Chinese global history tradition as well. But what, you know, because of the sheer number of languages that are, again, required, and again, time and money, it's like trying to find works and people who are able to speak across those linguistic and thus consequently those methodological divides as well is very challenging. Obviously, we're in the UK and we're an English language journal, and so hence we're focusing on English language global history publishing. But you know, it is important to think about how there are global histories that are rooted in other languages, both European and non.
Thank you very much. I think I have 2 questions that merge from the workshop and your talk in my head.
Them together.
First of which is, we have talked, for instance, for applying to journal that it shouldn't like look or sound like an area studies journal, that it should have a global reach. But sometimes I wonder how we can do global history without that kind of training, in terms of like, where do we then learn the languages and the context that we're going to study? So I feel like both go hand in hand rather than like direct opposites. And second one would be, we also talked a little about methodology. And I was wondering what global history methodology is. I mean, you said sensitivity, that really, I understand that. But when we talk about methodology, I don't really understand what a global historian's methodology is compared to a social historian's methodology or a gender study person's methodology. So my question is, are there any really methodological differences between subdisciplines of history, or are we just basically historians with sensitivities that right now are merging? For instance, you can't now do history of science without looking gender, for instance. Or so I feel like you said the global history field is now established and is a separate field. But is it so now separate when we see that past and present and global history journal are basically publishing similar articles?
No. My whole point was to say it's a field and a sensibility, and anything can be both. You know, like gender is actually a good example. So you can have something that is an institutionalized field with its journals and its institutes and so on, but it is at the same time a sensibility that informs any kind of history writing, right? Good historical practice is expected to take into account the fact of gender, just as it is and will be even more expected to take into account an openness of the attention that is global, essentially, right? Or at least a basic readiness to follow your object, whatever. And that's the precise reason. And I think it's sort of the fact that it has made it into past and present and into American historical review is precisely a very good sign of the actually success of the field. It has informed history writing at every level. Like there are very few journals where you can publish now without actually taking that into consideration. So why there is no separation, on the contrary, both these developments go together in a way. And the same I would say for area studies. Of course, you are trained in a particular area of the world, and then you reach out. That I think is the path that most of us follow. You know, I did as well. You are trained in a particular world, you learn the languages, you understand the context and so on, and then you follow these people, these ideas, etc. You trace the connections that have an impact on it, and so on. And in terms of methods, yes, that is a question that I've given some thought to. The answer that we've come up with also in the book is that it's not necessarily a different kind of method, of course, although there are methods that we use more often than others, such as comparison, for instance, right? Generally, what you can say is that global history poses a set of methodological difficulties. That's why I said that at the beginning. It has problems that others encounter less so, like teleology, for instance, right? Other historians struggle with that much less, but we're not the only ones, right? And the same goes for how do you explain on a global scale, right? That poses particular difficulties because you have different kinds of explanations and so on, different kinds of factors that come, etc., as I was saying. So it's about methodological difficulties, but not necessarily a different methodology. Certainly not. I think there we use the basic tools that every historian uses.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I was wondering if you, I mean, in your study of the field, do you see a shift from the comparative method to the connective method? Because I mean, there was a time that like global history, to my understanding, was more about like comparing and making, you know, there was work for revolutions in the early 20th century and how like like how Mexico and China and Iran, like they all had like these. Whereas like today, there seems to be a tendency towards connecting the local to a broader, and whether you think that has more promises than shortcomings or not. I mean, I would appreciate your personal reflections on that.
Yeah, I'm not
Thanks.
a comparer, I have to say. In general, I would observe also from reading the Journal of Global History closely over the past few weeks, there is definitely a decline in explicitly comparative articles. And I think that that is something you see across the field. People do not formally compare anymore very often. I wouldn't say it has fallen from grace, but it has lost significance, definitely. And the other point is, however, that people still compare, and they often do it implicitly. For instance, by writing a history of bread, you know, implicitly you're comparing, like you're comparing different kinds of breads across the world, or a history of, I don't know, the car or the whatever, you know, the kinds of commodity histories and so on, histories of dynasties, etc. These are ultimately comparative histories, but they're not necessarily framed on the surface anymore. Or whenever you claim that something is singular, you're essentially comparing because you're making a claim about other things that are out there and so on. So a lot of comparison is implicit. It's not spelled out anymore. That may sometimes be detrimental, actually. You know, it's better to be transparent about what you're doing. And the other point is, that's my last part of the answer. In the 1990s, there was a discussion about, again, comparison, and at the time it was called transfer, especially in the German historiography. They discussed it a lot. And whether that excluded one another or whether that was actually mutual compatible. And they arrived at the answer, very surprisingly, that it was compatible, of course. And then that question came up again and again. You know, sometimes we repeat ourselves. That actually has to do with different language spheres. But for a long time now, I think it has been perfectly uncontroversial that you can compare and sort of follow connected histories at the same time, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Simpson at University of Warwick. I'm an environmental historian, which probably explains some of what I'm going to say. Really enjoyed the talk, and thanks also for just your great work over the years. I wanted to ask you about crisis, and I think I kind of wholeheartedly agree, for what it's worth, with the sense that there's an awful lot of like navel gazing that goes on around like disciplinary crisis. But it sort of seems to me, at least, that the notion that there is, you know, there are profound kind of political, environmental, social crises occurring that really unfold and take on new forms in the 20-year history of the journal might prompt us to think that the remit and the kind of the methods of global history and the way that it should be done as a discipline necessarily must change as well. And I guess I kind of wanted to push you a bit also with the history of science hat on to kind of think about like the degree to which global history could go from something where in the one of the quotes that you put up from 2012, there was almost like this sort of luxury of aspiration, right? This idea that I think in the Armitage piece, you know, it is time for us to put the national historians on the defensive. There was kind of this possibility of an aspiration to do that, to instead, you know, being the kind of purveyors of ways of thinking about the world, and some of our foundational principles as global historians are very embattled and have kind of are clearly not supported by those in political power in many parts of the world, right? Does that mean that global history has to become more of a kind of activist, insurgent subdiscipline? Does it need to become a crisis discipline that sort of takes on different methodologies, that takes on a more avowedly polemical tone and tenor at times? Like, is there a place for that?
I was afraid that someone would ask that question. You did it. Thank you. You know, whether or not you are political in your scholarship is up to you. I won't give you a sense of direction. I'm personally never comfortable with it, so I'm not good at it. I'm not good at being polemical and political, and that's why I don't do it. But I think that's a question of personal style, also the academic tradition that you're in, and the country in which you live, whether you can allow yourself to be polemical and political and outspoken, because there are places where you cannot do that. What I think will happen, and has already begun to happen with, you know, all these histories of disintegration and so on, is that we're gonna change with the times, as we always have. And it means I expect to see a lot more on warfare, for instance, which is a global phenomenon, if ever there was one. I expect to see a lot more scholarship on crisis, on refugees movement, on poverty, on disconnection, on energy crises. I expect to see a lot in the next couple of years. Yes. So shout out to the environmental historian. There's a lot to be done in that regard. So I expect us to, you know, absorb the virtues and vices of the world that we live in, and to reflect it in a way as we and so many other historians do and have always done. But whether or not you want to engage politically with what is going on, that I think I wouldn't want to, you know, offer a recommendation that is general.
Thank you so much for this. This was very exciting, and lots of sort of food for thought.
Thank you.
I had two slightly different directions of the questions. One was more basic. Sorry, my name is Malika. I forgot to. Sort of on the labels and the framings around global history, how helpful is it that we have diverged into different directions of world history, trans-imperial history, transnational history? Is this a sign of sort of the very many exciting things that we're looking at in terms of connected comparative histories around the world, or is this a form of hindrance? And something that didn't really come up in the workshop, but was on my mind as Elisabeth and others were discussing, was the question of collaboration. And it also goes back to Ria and Patrick's point earlier, the role of collaboration as global historians. How important is it? Should we be centralizing collaboration? I was at Sven Beckett's talk a couple of days ago, the global, and I left with the impression of surely this amazing, huge book would be so much more powerful if it was sort of a powerful collaborative work of all of these people around. And this could be said about all sorts of global history. But yeah, sort of thinking about collaboration in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, collaboration is something that, again, for decades, historians have been saying, global historians have been saying, one way to get around the dilettantism problem, to get around the fact that we cannot know everything, to get around the fact that we've mostly been trained in one or at most two areas where we actually have mastered the languages. One way around that is collaboration. Yes. And you still see surprisingly little of it. So people keep saying, oh, we have to collaborate. And that would be a wonderful way to move forward. But they don't do it that often. You very rarely, I don't know about the journal, but I saw very few co-authored articles actually. And when people co-author, they're usually in a field that's relatively similar or close to one another. And that has, again, to do with the academic structures that we live in and move in, because you have to get tenure or you have to get a ref, whatever point. And so people single author, because that's what we do in the humanities. But I would sort of definitely subscribe to the notion that it could be extremely productive not to do that and to collaborate, but really collaborate with someone who is far away from you. Sometimes you see a lot of edited volumes, but there you see a similar tendency. In the introduction, people go like, oh yeah, collaboration is so important. But then everyone works on their own thing, you know, and sometimes you even get volumes that call themselves global history, but you have area specialists working on their own area and then working on, I don't know, decolonization in South Asia, decolonization in Latin America, decolonization. So yes, morally speaking, wonderful idea, has been brought up several times over the past few decades, has been done comparatively little. And then the different directions. I always wonder how different trans-imperial and world and connected and global history really are from one another. And sometimes it's about labeling, and sometimes these moves are, at least from the institutions that I know better, they're often strategic, like you want to justify either the importance of your own book or your theoretical finesse or your institutional separation from whatever. But it's often strategic moves rather than moves that are intellectually really necessary. And I don't mean to say that someone who does connected history did not want to make a point that was valuable and important at the time. I just wonder whether you cannot make that within a wider label, which you always have to work on and improve and add nuance to, and, you know, adjust and readjust again, because times are changing and you learn and you improve the quality of your methods and sort of overcome methodological differences and so on. So therefore, I'm a bit skeptical about labels in general, but again, that's just me.
I'll put a shout out. We had a really brilliant article we published last year about deforestation and kind of environmental history, indigenous history, South American history. And I think it was co-written by about 8 different scholars. It's absolutely, it's a great model. It's like that sort of thing. We would so love to see more of that in the journal. Excellent. Guido's going to ask the last question from online. And then after that, we are going to wind up, quick round of applause. And then there's wine, there's reception in the corner. So people have an option to ask more questions of Stephanie then, but let her have a drink first. But Guido, over to you before we close out.
Yes.
So this is a question from Chen Hao from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. It follows up on Tom Simpson's question about crisis, but they say that basically, you've spoken about crisis from the perspective of researchers. Do you think there's also a crisis in implementing this discipline into the education of history? So then they develop saying, how should we explain to...
Can you repeat that?
So from the perspective of teaching global history,
yes,
is there a particular challenge which they describe here? Is there a crisis in how we I suppose, institutionalize global history in our teaching? So then they developed to say, how do we explain to a 20-year-old bachelor student that global history is cool because you have to acquire several languages so that you can read piles of secondhand literature and that you have to be anti so many isms?
Okay, I don't know what to say about the anti-isms, but then of course, you know, I mean, I alluded to that. We're so anti-Eurocentric and we're so anti-everything, but at the end of the day, we replicate a lot of that actually. So the gesture of being against an ism is easy. The rest is a lot harder. Crisis of teaching, wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis because that implies, you know, I'm a historian of fever, that implies some kind of curve. But the difficulties of teaching, definitely. I mean, all all of the things that I said about the difficulties of practicing global history, multiply that by 10 when you teach. And I know that sort of one of the reasons why I actually prefer to offer global history students to courses to students who are sort of in their late BA or ideally already in their masters is because it's difficult. It's yet another variable. It's not yet another factor. So it might make sense to start with histories that have less layers in a way, less of a scope, less of a range, to teach the basic methods and then sort of put that on top. So I see where the question is coming from. Yes, especially multilingualism makes it difficult to put them into practice. You can still teach the basics, but put it into practice for a student is difficult. Yes, that wasn't very uplifting as a final thing to say, but it was honest.
Perhaps we could also say then for the student who suddenly finds out it's going to cost like 200 pounds to fill their car with petrol, I think looking at that and tracing those supply chains and global affairs also provides a really important way of showing why people need to study global history, because it's not just a new phenomenon in our current moment. So, but also everyone to study foreign languages. This is a real limitation in the British PhD program. I can say this for those online, even though I have an American accent because I did a PhD here. Anyways, Stephanie, thank you again so much for taking the time to do this, for raising, I think, a lot of provocations and for giving us a great opportunity to reflect on the field. Join me in a round of applause and then do join us for a drink. So
thank you.
I must add, thanks to the KRAM and Joe and the administrative and technical staff and to the CUP and the Department of History of the University of Notre Dame and the William P. Reynolds Chair for the financial support that's necessary this evening. But I don't think there's anything else to say except that it's been a great privilege to have the Journal of Global History with us at Notre Dame this evening, and an enormous treat to be able to listen to Stephanie. She deserves even a further round of applause, but actually I think it's time to go and get a drink, and she certainly deserves that. Thank you very much.